Tom Cameron Swayze.
Chet Huntley. David Brinkman. John Chen.
Tom Brokaw.
A White House welcome for the Chinese president's first visit to the U.S. Tonight, oil, Iran, and the heckler who disrupted the script. Life and death. Why are families of some 9/11 victims testifying for Zacarias Moussaoui in his death penalty trial? The payoff, a new stir tonight over multi-million-dollar pay packages for some CEOs. Is $1.6 billion perhaps too much? And driven to distraction, the truth about other drivers doing other things while behind the wheel, and what happened to our camera crew while they were reporting this story.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. The stakes were understandably high today when the president of China arrived at the White House for the first time. President Bush welcomed President Hu in grand style. But it was not an official state visit, and that in itself was a subtle message. There are a number of issues between these two nations, and that became clear when the Chinese president started his speech, and a not-so-subtle message was shouted out by a woman standing with the news media. A minor incident in the scope of things, but one that might have set the tone for the entire day. We begin with NBC News Chief White House correspondent David Gregory. And David, where did it go from there?
Brian, quite a ways, in fact. The president later apologized to President Hu at the outset of their one-on-one meeting. This was considered to the president a major embarrassment, and it came on a day that was tightly scripted down to the last detail. The atmosphere was formal for Hu Jintao's first visit to the White House, the setting tightly secured. Yet when President Hu began to make his remarks, there was a rare interruption.
President Bush! Stop him! We'll kill him!
The protester was later identified as Wang Wenyi, a reporter working for a newspaper linked to the spiritual group Falun Gong, which is banned in China. Mr. Bush encouraged Hu to keep speaking, saying, "You're okay." But the outburst was a major irritant to the Chinese leader since the White House gave her a day pass to attend the event. She was arrested and later charged with disorderly conduct and attempting to intimidate a foreign official. The spectacle, as well as throngs of protesters outside the White House today, was a fitting backdrop to a strong message the president sent on human rights in China.
China can grow even more successful by allowing the Chinese people the freedom to assemble, to speak freely, and to worship.
Numerous disputes between the U.S. and China, from trade to Iran's nuclear program, were later discussed in the Oval Office, where the president reported progress but no breakthroughs.
We don't agree on everything, but we're able to discuss our disagreements in the spirit of friendship and cooperation.
David Gregory back with us at the White House. And David, how did this all play back home in China?
Well, the bottom line is it didn't play at all, Brian. The Chinese leadership blacked out this entire incident on state-run television, so nobody ever saw it. Images were pretty important to them today.
And for those who might think too much is being made of this, again, comparatively minor incident given the whole day, what have you learned about the lasting significance of this tonight?
The point is that this was a visit that was so tightly scripted, and it had been planned for months in advance, and images mattered more than substance, frankly, today. There were no major agreements. One veteran diplomat who was on hand today said there's no way that the Chinese won't think that this was an intentional move by the administration.
You mentioned a whiff of progress on Iran. Any specifics?
No real specifics other than that they share the goal that they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But again, the Chinese don't want sanctions in the United Nations, and that's a stumbling block right now.
Thanks, David. David Gregory at the White House tonight. Also high on the agenda for the Chinese president's visit, the topic of oil, specifically China's growing appetite for it. Now, the U.S. is by far the #1 oil consumer in the world. We drink up more than 20 million barrels of it every day. China consumes about a third of that, 6.5 million barrels a day. But it's growing, and so the president warned China not to try to lock up the world's supply. More now from NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell.
Gasoline at more than $3 a gallon.
Way too expensive. It's unnecessary.
And in California today, an astonishing $4.29 for premium.
America is addicted to oil.
Skyrocketing prices here, not only because of U.S. demand, but also rapid-fire growth half a world away. China recently surpassed Japan to become the world's second largest consumer of oil. This is no longer a nation of bicycles. By 2010, China is expected to have 90 times the number of cars it had in 1990. By 2020, its energy needs will increase by 150%. So China is buying oil anywhere it can find it.
They are willing to do business with a lot of countries that the U.S. would find repugnant.
Hotspots like Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Sudan.
There are places that have oil that are using oil as a weapon or using oil as a carrot for certain policies, and that's troubling.
China's extraordinary growth is one reason oil supplies are now razor thin. What used to be a worldwide cushion of 6 million barrels a day 4 years ago is now down to 1 million barrels, not enough to withstand a crisis in oil-producing countries. And who's doing more to conserve, China or the U.S.?
They have much more ambitious plans than we here in the United States do. They want to have 15% of all their energy come from renewable energy sources by 2020.
What America needs to realize is that the U.S. never before had a huge competitor for the little crude oil that is available. A competitor that is also growing faster than its supply of energy. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
In this country, defense lawyers in the Zacarias Moussaoui death penalty trial finished presenting their side of the case today. They're hoping to persuade the jury to spare Moussaoui's life, asking instead for life in prison. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams was in the courtroom in Virginia again today. And Pete, some people might be surprised at who testified on Moussaoui's behalf today.
Right, that was more people who were family members of those who died on 9/11, but this time they were testifying for the defense, which suggests that they oppose giving Moussaoui the death penalty.
The jury has now heard from 13 family members as defense witnesses, including the sister of Jeremy Glick and the mother of Mark Bingham.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask these relatives of the 9/11 victims today, their testimony, while they didn't come out and say he should be spared, why can't they say it in so many words?
Well, they're not allowed to do that, Brian. They can't tell the jury what they think the verdict should be any more than those called by the government, because they think Moussaoui ought to get the death penalty.
And his defense still basically insanity.
Well, yes, although that technically would be in the guilt phase. His defense lawyers want the jury to consider as a factor as they decide between life and death that he has a mental disease, schizophrenia. They had doctors who testified that he has delusions, that he thought his defense lawyers were going to try to kill him in court by staging a suicide attack, that he thought the FBI was going to plant a bug in an electric fan somebody gave him before he was arrested, and the biggest one of all, that he thinks President Bush will pardon him, Brian.
More turns in this confusing case today in Northern Virginia. Pete Williams outside court for us tonight. Pete, thanks. Now to the long road back from Hurricane Katrina and the return of an aspect of life in New Orleans that no one wanted to see again. Even as the city struggles to get back on its feet, violent crime is making a comeback in the last 24 hours, in fact. Reporting from our New Orleans bureau, here is NBC's Martin Savage.
A troubling sign of life returning to News, New Orleans.
Other news tonight, we got word this morning that former First Lady Betty Ford was hospitalized for tests today. A family spokesperson said the visit to Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage, California was routine and that the 88-year-old is in good health. On Wall Street here in New York today, a mixed finish for stocks. The Dow added to the gains of the past 2 days, up another 64 points, touching a 6-year high, in fact. NASDAQ lost a bit of ground, however, down just over 8 points on the day. We'll take a break when NBC Nightly News continues here this Thursday night. NBC News In Depth. Runaway pay. CEO compensation back in the spotlight. Is $1.6 billion perhaps too much? And later, a new study on what they call DWD, driving while distracted. Just how dangerous is it?
News with Brian Williams, this year's winner of the prestigious George Foster Peabody Award and the Sigma Delta Chi Award from the Society of Professional Journalists.
We're back with NBC News In Depth tonight. Runaway pay. A lot of attention is being paid these days to the stratospheric sums that some CEOs make in this country. Two examples making headlines recently. Lee Raymond, ExxonMobil, recently retired CEO, whose salary alone was over $51 million last year. Then there's William McGuire, CEO of United Health Group. He received stock options that could end up totaling a staggering $1.6 billion. The issue tonight in depth from NBC News Chief Financial Correspondent Ann Thompson.
I have never had a conversation in my whole career with anybody about my compensation. It just doesn't happen.
This week, an unapologetic Lee Raymond, Exxon's former CEO, defended his headline-making pay, including his $98 million pension.
And the philosophy of the company has been that when the company does well, the shareholders should do well and the employees should do well.
But ultimately, this still comes down
This man, United Healthcare's William McGuire, could be America's first billion-dollar CEO. Some of his stock options granted at low points in the company's share price, with the potential for maximum profit when the stock rose.
I've been very fortunate and responsive to how well this company has performed on behalf of the people there.
Though both Exxon and United Healthcare prospered, and so did their shareholders under Raymond and McGuire's leadership, some still see their huge compensation packages as CEO pay run amok.
We've seen in the cases of Exxon, for example, that the compensation of the CEO is largely being determined by events that are outside of the CEO's control. In this case, the price for oil.
And those who determine the CEO's pay, the board of directors, are all too often people chosen by the CEO. Executive compensation consultant Jan Koor says it is also influenced by what the market will pay.
There are a limited number of people who can do this. They're like the baseball player that can hit a 90-mile-an-hour fastball.
But the rate of pay has slowed. A shareholder advocacy group reports CEO packages went up a median of 11% last year compared to 30% the year before. Still, the outrage remains, with the average CEO taking home by one estimate 431 times what the average worker does. Ann Thompson, NBC News, New York.
Up next here tonight, the newest danger on the road. They call it driving while distracted.
NBC Nightly News tomorrow.
Authorities in southeast Kansas say they foiled a plot by 5 teenage boys there who were planning a killing spree at their high school in Riverton, Kansas today to mark 7 years since the massacre at Columbine. Sheriff's deputies say they found guns, ammo, knives, and messages written in code in the bedroom of one suspect. The boys were arrested after posting a warning about this alleged plan on the website myspace.com. A not-so-funny thing happened on our way to bringing you this next story. It's about distracted driving. All the things people do while they're also trying to drive. Well, tonight there is new evidence on tape that a lot of drivers are not keeping their eyes on the road, something our camera crew experienced before their very eyes. Here is NBC's Tom Costello.
It's a front seat look at the seconds leading up to a crash or near crash. The most common factors, distracted drivers, like the woman who looks down for just a second, then swerves into a telephone pole, or the driver checking his blind spot who looks up just as he slams into a spinning car. And drowsy drivers, like this man who nearly drifts off the road. Researchers at Virginia Tech loaded 100 cars with video cameras and digital recorders for 1 year, capturing 92 crashes, 761 near crashes, and 8,300 other incidents.
This study is a wake-up call to America to make sure to pay attention while you are driving.
The findings? Driver drowsiness was a factor in 20% of all crashes, and nearly 80% of all crashes or near crashes involved distracted drivers, with 18 to 20-year-olds 4 times as likely to be distracted. Drivers juggling CDs, or this woman dialing a cell phone just as a child rides into the street. Wireless devices are the most common distraction, and dialing a cell phone can raise the risk of an accident by 3 times. Reaching for something in the car, like food, raises that risk by 9 times.
They're eating like a full meal as they're driving down the road,
talking to someone in the car.
Virginia State Trooper Terry Licklider took us along to show us how common distracted driving is. But within an hour, he was sideswiped by a driver in a red Mustang who police say was impaired, making him distracted.
357 Fairfax.
He had to be chased down.
Got right up and hit us.
The dangers of distracted driving driven home. Tom Costello, NBC News, Washington.
One of the bravest men who ever lived has died. Scott Crossfield, the legendary test pilot of the Cold War era, was found in the wreckage of his single-engine plane in the Georgia countryside today. Crossfield was the first man to fly the X-15, back when there was no guarantee that it would fly. He was the first man to fly at Mach 2, and along with his friend and rival, Chuck Yeager, he was immortalized for having the right stuff in the film of the same name.
Another historic flight takes place as Scott Crossfield streaks across the skies over the high desert in California. Mach 2.
To Scott Crossfield, the fastest man alive. That's it.
Crossfield was flying to his home in Virginia when his small plane dropped off radar screens. He was an icon among aviators who made his name by pushing the envelope at blistering speeds and at the edge of the atmosphere. But in the end, he lost his life behind the controls of his Cessna 210 when it crashed into the woods of northern Georgia. Scott Crossfield was 84 years old. We'll take a break here tonight. When we come back, the new Vanishing Act and what they used to call Old Hollywood.
Fears. Are we prepared for a possible deadly pandemic? Special reports on today, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, MSNBC.com, and Dateline Sunday with a look at what could happen if it hits the U.S. Bird flu, facts and fears, starting Friday on NBC News.
Tonight here we have a story for all those who've ever been tempted to buy one of those maps of the stars. It's a story about how Hollywood has changed, not just the pictures, but the landmarks, the great old places in places like Beverly Hills. If you've ever thought about seeing them, look fast. They're becoming great big new places very quickly. NBC's Josh Mankiewicz reports tonight on the constantly changing landscape in the land of the moving picture.
Something's Hills.
That's our broadcast for this Thursday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We hope you can join us tomorrow evening. Good night.
Tomorrow on Today, how far would you go for good medical care? This man had dental work in Mexico, and he's a retired dentist. Would you watch today?
Tom Cameron Swayze. Ed Huntley. David Benson. John Chen. Tom Brokaw.
Terror attack at a resort area